Welcome to Modus Cafe. Join us for fun, lighthearted, and educational conversations around training, athletic longevity, and the human side of climbing, with your hosts, Mercedes Pollmeyer and Katja Dev.
All right, so welcome to another Modus Cafe podcast, and we're continuing on our training series with Steve Bechtel. I'm very excited about this one. This is probably my favorite topic that we're about to talk about today because at Modus, we really do believe that general strength or general preparation is kind of the foundation of movement, of health and longevity. And so Steve and I are going to talk about the importance of general strength training for climbers. And we also, which is very lovely, we have Katja here today again. Hello, hello. So Katja is going to make sure that we're asking the right questions for our listener base, and make sure Steve and I don't get too off track. But yeah, so let's get started. Let's talk about general strength for climbers. But how about we make it even more simple? Like, what is general strength, maybe for the average human or maybe a beginner climber? Steve.
Well, strength is the fundamental ability to generate force. And the really important take home from strength is that all of the facets of our fitness are derivatives of strength. So like you alluded to, specific strength is a derivative of general strength. Endurance is a derivative of strength. Power is a derivative of strength. And so if you're going to increase an athlete's power, for example, we can increase the speed that they're moving, or we can increase the force that they're moving, or we can do both. And if we don't ever generate more force, we don't elevate the strength, then we're not able to generate that power to those high levels. Mm-hmm. And so when an athlete is feeling like they can't do the moves on a climb, or when they are feeling taxed by carrying a backpack or the work that's done throughout an entire day, even though it might feel like it's an endurance problem, it may actually go all the way back to their simple ability to generate a little bit of force. And so general strength training is not only good for rock climbers, but we see it across all sports disciplines and really across human lifespan. The stronger a person is, the less likely they are to die from any cause as they start to age. And so it's a really interesting and important part of training for climbing, but it's really an important part of being an adult human being.
Well, would you say that, so like from what you said, it sounds like strength is really, it is the foundation of anything that we do. So it can improve your endurance, it can improve your power, it can improve your power endurance. But if we flip it, let's say, okay, if we're doing just endurance training, that might not actually translate the same way, like because strength really forms that foundation. So if we are doing a lot of endurance, it doesn't necessarily mean that endurance enhances our strength. Maybe it does a little bit, but the relationship of strength to all of these different facets seems to be the glue.
For sure. A way, if you're doing it formulaically, you could say strength, or well, let's put it this way: endurance is strength divided by time. You're really like there's really not an endurance sport. Even a marathon has a limit. And so it's not like who can run the furthest before they fall down. It's really who can run 26.2 miles the fastest. And so as we want to improve, once we have the ability to go that 26.2 miles, then it becomes a problem of energy systems and speed and strength of not only like general strength, but leg specific strength. An interesting thing there is once in a while we'll get an endurance athlete that says, oh, I ski all the time, or I run all the time, and therefore my legs are strong enough. I have a strong lower body, but that in the terms of sports science, that's not really strength. The ability to do, like, I think running, you'll do around 2,000 steps a mile. And so 2,000 repetitions in around 10 minutes for the average runner is not a strength output. Body weight, running down the road just isn't enough to overload those muscles to get stronger after they've attained that basic level. And so we do need to overload them even more. And so the really key thing there is, yes, endurance is useful, but it doesn't create more strength the way that strength can create more endurance.
Yeah, I think that's really the important factor here. And I am curious, do you have athletes who might question or push back on training general strength?
For sure.
Yeah.
The number one thing is we have fear around things that are unfamiliar to us. And if we can't see a direct comparison between the preparatory activity and the performance environment, we tend to have this little bit of confusion. And when we're confused, our mind says no to that thing. And so one of the things that people associate with strength training is the sport of bodybuilding. And they go, oh, bodybuilders lift weights and their muscles get really, really big. I don't want to get big muscles, so I will not use those tools. But strength training and bodybuilding are two different things. You're standing on your feet when you're playing golf or when you're running an ultra marathon, but they're very different activities, even though they're both done standing. And really, bodybuilding and strength training are quite divergent. And so when we talk about strength training, we talk about a very specific use of overloading the body in some limited ways. One of the things is the bodybuilding revolution of the 70s, 80s, sort of fixed in the mind that we needed to train all these body parts. I need to do my biceps and my triceps and my shoulders, and Monday is chest day, and Friday is leg day, and all the things that are associated with bodybuilding, but none of those things are actually appropriate for strength training. And so when we go into a strength training mode, we need to tell those athletes that it's much simpler than they think it is, and it's not going to bulk them up. If they put on mass, they're actually doing it incorrectly.
And it also seems like when you are kind of trying to build muscle, that actually takes a lot more effort, a lot more repetition in the gym compared to maybe heavy strength training, like the general prep that we're trying to do. So I think it really, then you're just becoming a lifter at that point, or a bodybuilder.
Well, and you probably know a few bodybuilders. I know quite a few, and the idea that just going in and lifting some weights and I'm going to get real big is so enraging to these people, because they are just working so hard and they train really, really specifically for muscle size, and it's super hard, even for somebody that's optimizing for nutrition, optimizing work and recovery cycles. They still have a really hard time putting on this mass or maintaining it. Maintaining high levels of mass requires even more high loads of training. And so unless you're really just chasing that, it's not going to happen the way that we think it does. The thing that's interesting is if you walk an athlete through it and you say, okay, let's talk about bulk. And we say, okay, let's look at a boulderer, and what do they look like? They don't have like some kind of weird, gigantic muscles. They might have big forearms because we spend a lot of time loading those. But if we look at a normal strength training athlete, they don't call out to that they're like, oh my gosh, that person is gigantic. It's usually that person has a really strong strength weight ratio. They look powerful when they move. They tend to have good posture. They tend to recover well, but it's not like, oh, wow, that person looks crazy. But if we talk about certain endurance sports, and here's the interesting thing, lots of people decide that they want to do cardiorespiratory or endurance activities in order to lose weight and to look slim. But if I were to just to say, what if you were to describe the body type of a road cyclist, what would you say? You'd say, oh, they're skinny, except they have these gigantic thighs. Do they have those gigantic thighs because they do too much strength training in the gym? Or is it because they do a whole bunch of really light load, high repetition training? Same thing with a swimmer. Swimmers are famous for having nice broad shoulders, big back musculature, but it's not because of the associated strength training they're doing in the gym. It's because of the light load, high repetition training they're doing. And so the Shape Magazine advice to do light load, high rep training is actually hypertrophy advice. And so if you really want to make your muscles bigger, you should do high repetition, medium load stuff. But if you want to get stronger, it's really high force, low repetition training. And that's, as we know, quite divergent from a bodybuilding program.
And it is also like a bodybuilder or like having to grow muscles takes a lot more repetition compared to building strength. Like building strength is fairly efficient. We don't have to spend hours in the gym.
It's crazily efficient. And I think that when somebody is starting out, the most important thing is to understand the metric that you're chasing. Again, a bodybuilder is measuring the girth of their biceps and going, did I improve? We're interested in the force output of the muscle. Did I improve? Did I overload the muscle enough that I'm able to generate more force next time? That's the really cool thing about strength training is every single workout is gives you the feedback of a test. You're like, oh, okay, I did get stronger. I'm going to add some load here. And we don't always have to do single rep maxes or things like that, but session to session to session, whether it's working or not. And the really great thing about strength training is it always works if it's programmed correctly. It works across the board for human beings. And that's really fun to be in the strength coach realm, because you're not trying to give them a specific formula for like a diet or a specific formula for metabolic preparation program like you would for a runner. Sometimes you'll throw intervals at an endurance athlete and it doesn't quite get them the speed that you want. Too many things involved. Strength training is very simple. If you program it right, if you get the intensity right, people get stronger.
Well, this leads into a good segue into, okay, so we're climbers. We'll get into specific strength training for climbers in a little bit, but looking at general strength, what are some basic movements that we can train just to get stronger overall? What are your favorites?
Well, a really important way to look at the exercises is in terms of movement patterns, but I think the simpler concept still is to do exercises that require more than one joint when you make the movement. For example, a single joint movement would be like a biceps curl or a triceps press, where you're just moving the elbow. And so when we move just one joint, we isolate it to one specific muscle. Yet if I do something like a pull up where I'm still doing the bicep curl movement at the elbow, but I'm moving the shoulder and I'm actually getting some movement in the wrist as my body moves through a plane, then I've got a multi-joint movement that's using lots of muscle. And that in and of itself is specific to sport. But when we look at the efficiency of a strength training program, if I go in and I do a bicep curl and I do like a back fly, or I do something for my lat where I'm trying to piece together all the muscles that are involved in a pull-up, it might take me a long time to work all of those muscles. But if I go in and I do just a pulling movement, I cover the bases on a ton of muscles. And so if I cover a pressing movement with the upper body, a pulling movement with the upper body, I cover almost all of the upper body musculature in just 2 exercises. And those are really specific to sport. A lot of climbers will go like, oh yeah, you don't really need to push, like do a bench press movement or whatever. But there is a lot of pressing as soon as the hands are below the shoulders. It's a lot of pressing movement. Also, the movements on bouldering where we're using counter pressure, trad climbing's got a lot of pressing in it. Those two things, a pulling movement, a pressing movement, that's our upper body stuff. And then we do what's called a hinging movement where we bend primarily at the hip. We do a squat or a quad dominant movement where we bend primarily at the knee. And those cover almost all the lower body. And so in our gym, we like to do upper body press, upper body pull, hip hinge, squat, and then some core stability exercises. And that's a pretty good solid workout.
So simple. And you know, I think at Modus as well, we try to keep it as simple as possible. One thing we do notice though, so I'm curious how you might teach athletes this, is that, you know, strength is a skill. You do have to learn these movements for them to then be overloaded. And especially like for our clientele, like we train a lot of like older folks who like they're probably 35 and older and maybe have never strength trained before. And so for us, it's keeping that same movement pattern, but trying to teach them like how to move first. Do you have some sort of protocol, something that seems to help your athletes who are fairly new to training and having them understand that strength is a skill on its own?
Yeah. Well, if we looked at each of these movement patterns, and for today's example, let's just look at squatting as the primary one. We could say a squat holding, you know, a barbell on your shoulders or in front of your shoulders would be like the anchor movement in the squat pattern. And then you can progress that by making them more complicated movements, combination movements, or higher loads. We can also regress it by taking certain things away. For example, holding a barbell on your shoulders is a skill in and of itself, and a lot of people don't feel comfortable with that. But maybe holding a dumbbell in front of your shoulders with both hands or a kettlebell in a goblet squat is a good regression. But squatting, the hip movement, the knee movement is still really hard. Lots of people will go into the gym and they just can't quite get it. They don't have the hip mobility, they don't have the ankle flexibility to do it. And so that person may not be able to do a proper squat. And so how can we regress that? Almost everybody, almost every adult there is can do a split position squat or a lunge style pattern. And so the main thing for each athlete is to say, within this movement pattern, how far do I need to regress it? And it's not like the split squat is a lesser exercise than a regular squat. It's just a different position that doesn't require as much mobility in the hips and ankles. So when we do that, you can still take a split squat, load it up with a lot of load, and make it quite a hard strength exercise. But it's a pattern where that athlete can start succeeding. They can start succeeding at a simpler version of it, and then work on the flexibility to get into the positions that are required by the more complex versions. Some athletes are never going to get there, and they don't really need to. You don't need to get to where you can do an overhead squat when you're 60. You just need to be able to move up and down. And so that person might end up doing step ups, lunges, you know, a side lunge. You could even do like drive sled, like pushing a sled across the gym. Those are all excellent squat pattern exercises, and they're all along that continuum of simple to very complex. And so then we use the simplest version that we can successfully complete, and then we overload that to make the legs stronger. I can do that with pulling, I can do it with pressing, I can do it with hinging. And every single athlete you come across is going to be able to do some version of it. I haven't run into too many people that can't do a push-up against a wall. And that would be maybe a beginning position for pressing, where, you know, single arm dumbbell bench press on a ball or something would be really complex and maybe not appropriate for all the athletes. And so if you talk to your athletes about those patterns, then we can make changes. Then we can start them where they will get the most out of it when they start.
Just to follow this up, Steve, and you started alluding to this a little bit with the idea of like people not being able to, you know, do a wall push-up essentially. Oh yeah, sorry, I got a notification. So my question is, you described all these exercises super well, but we have a lot of athletes who are very new to strength training. And there, as you said, there's a little bit of a fear of entering even just the weight room.
Mhm.
And so I'm curious, do you have any super entry level exercises you could talk about? Because even just you talked about like some regressions to the squat, but even like some people might be nervous to even just start with a kettlebell.
Yeah.
So where do you think people could start if they're like, okay, Steve, you've convinced me, strength training is important. I'm super nervous. I feel like I'm super out of shape. I haven't been to the gym in a while. I normally just like to go to the gym and climb V2s, and I love that, but I do really want to get stronger. But, I can't do a pull-up. I can't do a push-up. Where do I start? Where do I get started?
I think everyone has a basic familiarity with some exercises. And so if he said, okay, we're going climbing, when we're climbing, we're getting a lot of core work. We're probably getting a little bit of leg work. We're getting a lot of pulling work. Most people, whether they want to or not, when they start out and they're in those first few V grades, they tend to pull more than they need to. It's sort of a natural human thing. And so I would say with most climbers, we don't need to start out having even that pulling pattern in there. One of the things I would say is starting with strength training is to set up in your kitchen before you even feel like going into the weight room. And the kitchen counter is a good height for a lot of people to do some push-ups. And so you get in there, get straightened out, make sure you can even take a selfie video. You don't need to post it online. You just do it for yourself. But make sure that your back is straight. And then we come down, put your chest all the way to the counter, and then push yourself back up. If you can do 5 or 6 of those, you're too strong for that exercise at that incline. And so then we can go down to maybe a table height, or then maybe put our hands on the couch or one of the stairs and eventually do push-ups on the ground. Once you can do 5 or 6 or 10 push-ups on the ground, then you can continue to advance that, like by moving into the weight room and adding load. The other thing is that split position. I'll have people get next to the counter, put their hand like the kitchen sink's easy because it's kind of a handle. Get right next to the kitchen sink, get in a split squat position. That's one leg in front of the other. Drive down until you touch your knee to the floor and then come back up. Most people that are entering climbing can probably do that pretty well. If I can do 5 or 6 of those on each side, then I can start to add load. Put a weighted backpack in one hand. You can put the backpack on, but start to add a little bit of load to that. So then if we do split position squat and the push up, and maybe even just like a simple plank exercise, that's sufficient strength training just to get you started with some strength training. And then you can start to add exercises as you learn them. Even my most advanced athletes, Katja, are still learning a new exercise. And so they'll probably do 3 or 4 exercises that they've got mastered, and then one that's new to them, whether it's just a variation of something or a completely new complex lift, but always trying to expand that movement repertoire. But I think you're right. It's so nerve-wracking, and you're like, I don't know if I can do this. The other thing is to really focus on the intensity rather than the exercises at first. The exercises are sort of the last thing we do when we're putting together a program. The first thing is getting the repetitions or the difficulty correct. Because if I can do 30 repetitions of something, it's not heavy enough for me to get stronger from. Likewise, if I can't quite do a pull-up, like hanging from the bar and trying is maybe too much overload for me to actually get stronger. And so somewhere in that, I can do 5 or 6 of them really, really well is a good place to start. And a couple of days a week of that for a little while, and you'll start to see those numbers improve.
That was really amazing. Thank you for explaining this. I love the kitchen example because everybody has a kitchen. So everybody can try it at home, because I think that's one of the things, a lot of the feedback that I'm getting is, but where do I start and how do I start? And even though we try to make it as simple as possible already, there's still this idea of I'm not strong enough to even get started. So I loved all of these. And I do have a follow-up question for anybody who wants to try out your kitchen exercises at home, which I think are a really great way to get started. Let's say I just listened to your podcast episode, Steve, and I try this. and I couldn't do 5 lunges or 5 push-ups at home. Should I just keep practicing them at home before I go to the gym? And if so, how do I prepare myself best so I can feel more confident going into the gym?
Yeah, there's so much available information, and it's easy to get there and just like, oh, I'm going to watch this video and then I'm going to do it. But if you went to like uh, YouTube and you said correct lunge, whatever form, you'd get like 10 answers. And so I think the really important thing is, does it feel like I can do it smoothly and correctly, or does it feel like I'm really doing this badly? The other thing is, if you can't quite do it, you can do two different things. You can unload it, which means like you could put your hands on like between two chairs and help yourself up and down in your lunge, or you can reduce the range of motion. So I'm only going to lunge. I'm only going to drop 8 inches, and then I'm going to come back up. And then I'm going to do 8 inches. And if I can do that for a couple of days, then I'll go down 10 inches. Then I'll go down 12 inches. So we can reduce range of motion. We can reduce load. But the really critical thing there is the continuity of the process. If we don't overload ourselves regularly, we don't make adaptations to it. And we talk about this with sun tanning, with calluses, with you name it. Your body adapts to these regular processes way better than super go for it on day one and then get destroyed by it. That's a really important lesson, is that strength training should not leave you incapacitated for the next several days. And what it should do is give you this feeling of like, ooh, I definitely did something, and I'm going to be a little tired tomorrow, but I'm not going to, need assistance to get up and down off the toilet. And so the thing with strength training is similar to like if we went tanning, like it's just springtime now here where I live. If I went outside, lay out on my porch for 6 hours, I'm going to get I'll probably end up in the hospital because of my sunburn. But if I went out for 5 minutes today, 6 or 7 minutes the following day, 10 minutes the following day, I'm going to continue to adapt to sun exposure by getting darker and darker skin. And so the thing with training is this pursuit of fatigue or of these discrete markers of I did too much is really backward from what you want when it comes to long-term progress.
Okay, so, oh man, I wanted to talk about a lot of different things just based on what you said, Steve. That was really good. But because you ended with intensity, so just from a lot of like social media stuff that we've been posting and trying to kind of convince climbers to maybe stay away from training to failure, and how that like in anything that they're really doing, unless they're really physically prepared for it. So we're trying really hard to teach people that they can still make a lot of progress working in this moderate to high intensity while avoiding failure, because from my standpoint, the things that I've seen from athletes is that they have a higher risk of injury if they're continually going to failure. And as you said, you could just kind of feel wrecked, and it takes a lot longer to recover from. So when someone is trying to find the right intensity, do you have like some tips for someone trying to, especially as they're new, because a lot of people don't know what their max effort is. Like finding that effort can take a long time too. Again, it comes back to that skill set of training. So yeah, do you have any tips on what the intensity should feel like, and over time, like how that might shift? Like what are they looking for?
Yeah. Well, there are two things there. The first is like chasing this failure point in training is again a way, one of the bodybuilding methods. But it also like if you put it in terms of anything else, you're like, oh yeah, that is really dumb. Like if you went out and you ran as hard as you could until you just fell down, and then you're like, okay, I'm going to rest for a second. I'm going to run as far as I can. You're like, how does that prepare me for a marathon? It's very, very difficult to say that like going to absolute failure, like if I ran out my door and ran down the driveway and down the street, I'd probably make it about 20 seconds before I had to stop if I was going full speed. And then I'd have to recover for a long time before I got to do that same speed or intensity again. And so that's counterproductive to me, especially if my goal is to improve my running volume or my running ability. Now, in the weight room, we teach people to try to stop at technical failure. And what that means is when the movement speed slows or the way the person does the exercise changes, that means they're getting very close to this failure point, and that's the place that we need to stop the training. There's a great body of research now on tempo of training, and the most important part of that is when the tempo starts to slow, we've already gone past the point that the athlete has gotten a strength stimulus, and so they can stop and they can know that in the next few days they're going to get stronger from that workout. So what we do is, say I have you doing pull-ups, and I'm going to have you do 4 sets of 5 pull-ups. Set 1, you do 5 of them, and you've got some weight hanging from your harness, and they're all the same tempo, they're all the same good range of motion. Set 2, you do 5 more, and they're all the same good tempo, all the same range of motion. If in set 3, you start to slow down at the 4th rep or something, I'm just going to have you stop there, and we're going to put things away for the workout. If you get through set 3 and you get all 5 of them, on set 4, I'm going to have you do as many repetitions as you can. And so that might be more than 5. And so if you do 5 in the first set, 5 in the second set, 5 in the third set, and that 4th set, you get up there and you're able to do 8 or 10 of them, what that tells you is that you're way too strong for the load that you've been using, and it's time to go up in weight. If you do 5 and 5 and 5, and then 3 or 4 of them, that's appropriate load. And so you can probably stick with that same load for a couple of workouts until that last set gets to higher and higher repetitions. But anytime that you get up into reps higher than what you had programmed in that last set, you're able to know that athlete can go up in load. Now, the other way is, if I am trying to do 5 of them and at the end of the first set, I'm still struggling and I'm pulling and I like start moving my shoulders around or something, that load's too heavy. And so I need to back off a little bit. That high load is a danger zone. I'm going to probably get hurt if I keep trying to address that all the time. And that if I go too low, I end up not stimulating myself enough. Like if I do 3 sets of 5 at a load that I could do for 15 repetitions, it's not really going to stimulate my body to adapt. It's like me stepping into the sun for 20 seconds. I'm not going to get tan. And so we want to make sure that sweet spot is there, and that last repetition, as many good, clean reps as possible, is a really great way for people to figure it out.
Okay, I love that. Yeah, so technical failure is a big one. Changes in tempo, that might be your first indication that technique is starting to fail, and you stop there. Okay, I will confess something. When I hit a technical failure, I will stop, but I end up doing cluster sets. And so for those who might not know what a cluster set is, so Steve was saying 3 sets of 5. Let's say in the last one, I only get 3 really good pull-ups, and you stop, and then I might do 1 more rep, and I stop, and I might do 1 more rep to then finish that set of 5. What are your thoughts on cluster sets for strength? It's a little bit on an aside for like beginners. It's not something I would recommend beginners to do, but yeah, what do you think?
I think it's not a bad practice, Mercedes, because you are then maintaining capacity. One of the things that can happen is if I stop when I just get to 3 and I don't do any more of those, I'm not addressing the skill again, and I might start having a shorter and shorter workout. And so adding in a few extra reps at the end is fine, and especially if that athlete has the time for it. But you're right. For a beginner, it probably doesn't make as much difference. And the beginning weight training is you're so prone to strength gains that I would say we want to do the least we can do in any session in order to initiate a strength gain. What's really fascinating is when people are completely detrained, they've shown that walking on a treadmill can increase upper body strength in somebody that's totally detrained. And it's not like you're going to write an upper body program that's just walking on a treadmill, because it won't work for most athletic people. But when we're addressing a new skill and I'm just starting into pull-ups, there's probably not a great argument for doing more than a couple of sets of pull-ups and a couple of sets of push-ups and a couple of sets of squats until we have a little bit of capacity and our joints and our connective tissue are getting nice and strong. And then we can start to add more volume. But the only reason we do multiple sets of things is because we're unable to get a strength stimulus out of that first set. And I would say we want to do the least we can do of this supplemental training and still see a result. If the results start to fail, then we start to add more. And you're at a point in your career where those cluster sets are probably necessary in order to continue to help you improve your strength. And so even though it's an advanced technique, it is an appropriate one when the time comes.
Awesome. So let's talk about reps. So we have kind of been alluding to like this optimum range for sets and reps to really accumulate the right adaptation to the strength that we're trying to develop. So, and again, there is kind of like this fine line where you are building a lot of strength, and then if you go to the other side of the spectrum, now you're maybe optimizing for hypertrophy, but maybe just endurance. You know, it really just depends on the intensity. So I want to branch this into two. Someone who is very new to training, what maybe they're like as a first assessment, because it seems like you need to know where you're at as a beginner. And then as somewhat like someone who has some experience in training, what it like just generally for athletes, what's a good rep and set range that they could train kind of year round?
Yeah, I think the real important consideration here is to do few enough reps that you're not just mindlessly counting how many reps you're doing. Like if I said, we're going to go do bodyweight lunges till failure, you'll just be counting. You're not concentrating on the movement that you're doing. And so really like staying in that 3 to 6 range of repetitions is pretty good. And a person that's new to exercise might easily be able to do 10 reps at a lunge, for example, and not be able to add load. They'll have more endurance and work capacity than they actually have strength. And so your 5 rep max and your 10 rep max may not differ too much, especially when you're new to an exercise. But I would say a really good place to start is to try to do 2 sets of 4 to 6 repetitions of most exercises. And if you can do 2 sets of pressing exercises, say a push-up on my countertop, 2 sets of lunges, 5 reps on each side, 2 sets of pulling, and it doesn't have to be a pull-up on a pull-up bar. You can use a pull-down machine, and so you can adjust the load. But again, you want a technical failure to come around in the 4 to 6 range. And then 2 sets of some sort of hinging exercise. And the deadlift is a really complex thing, but we can do all kinds of different hinging exercises, even to the point of what they would call is like a wall reach. And one of the things that you'll do in a wall reach is stand about 3 feet, 3.5 feet from a wall, and then just reach out for the wall. You won't be able to quite touch it with your fingers. And so as you reach out and try to touch the wall, you'll go into a natural hinging position. If you can touch the wall easily, you step back a couple of inches until you're really having to hinge at those hips in order to be able to reach the wall. But that moves us into this perfect deadlifting position. And if you can do 5 or 6 of those, that's an excellent exercise.
I love that. That wall reach, I'm going to steal that.
And you can load that up with like a little medicine ball, like a 3 to 5 pound ball, and they can reach with this ball. They're having to engage the core, but you'll find that it's really hard not to have excellent hinging position if you're doing that. So you're squared up to the wall, feet shoulder width apart. And if you reach out toward the wall, if you touch it and it's easy, step back 2 inches, reach out again. If you touch it and it's easy, step back 2 inches. And eventually you'll get to this point that you're like, whoa, I'm really stretching those hamstrings. I'm really hinging at the hip. And stick to 2 sets of 5, because as weird as it might sound, if you haven't been doing this exercise, you can end up real sore from it.
Yeah. And actually, I think there's a really nice follow-up adaptation to this, which is finding balance. And for climbers, especially like on slab or dihedrals, finding that balance between like center of gravity and how far your hips need to go versus like your arm, like that. I think that exercise can actually benefit a wide range of things, not just strength. That's super cool. I think Katja has a follow-up question.
Yeah, I don't know if it's so much a follow-up question or more of a statement. One of the things that you said while you explained these concepts really nicely, Steve, was this idea of you stop when you fail, especially if it's in your 3rd set. That's like almost the perfect time to stop if you've hit the right intensity, because you've gotten enough strength stimulus. And I just want to emphasize this because I think sometimes, and this can go either way, but sometimes people have a hard time meeting their own bodies where they're at. But in order to get stronger, we have to do exactly that. And the strength stimulus is different for different people, right? So then sometimes people are trying to force themselves to do more because they have this idea of wanting to be stronger. But at that point, they're not beating their own body anymore, where the body is at. So the goal for us to really find that sweet spot to get stronger is to find that perfect strength stimulus. And sometimes that means we need to stop, like doing reps in the 3rd set. And that's okay, because you just met your body. You just did a great job strength training. That's what I'm saying. If you have to stop, after 3 reps in your 3rd set, that's great. You just stop right there because you've already done what you needed to do for your body. And at the same time, if it's easy to finish the 3rd set at that intensity, then you didn't meet your body where it's at because it was too easy for you. Maybe you felt strong because you could finish the 3 sets easily, and Mercedes programmed 3 sets for you. But that means you're not getting stronger if you're not increasing the intensity. So I kind of just wanted to reframe that for people, because sometimes there's our ego that we can bring to the gym in either direction. And I just really want to make sure, like, we're as coaches, we're just here to meet you and your body where you're at. And that means that's different for everybody. So thank you for explaining that so well, Steve.
I think that's a really important point, is that, and we're kind of talking, there's actually a model in sports science that they call the Arndt-Schultz law. It's ARNDT. It's 2 people's names, but it's a bell curve. And if we understimulate, if we do like 1 set at 1 pound, we don't see an improvement from it. And we see that often with people that I go to the gym 3 days a week. Why am I not getting better? I'm not overloading enough. Then you have the people that are like, I'm going to go in and do whatever the workout is that's written on the board at my gym, and I'm going to go as hard as I possibly can, and I'm going to leave it all on the floor of the gym. And that's probably overdoing it. Although I'm a huge fan of people trying really hard in the performance environment. I feel like just going hard all the time in training is actually not going that hard. And so I think that, because you're recovering so badly, because you're always throwing novel movements at your body, because you're always sore, you're just never able to put forth the true strength that you're capable of. And so finding your way into that middle of that bell curve is really important.
And so going back to, actually, you just said novel movements and how that can really derail your training too. And maybe there's like a shiny object syndrome, like I just saw this thing on Instagram or on YouTube and I'm going to start incorporating it. I think with the patterns that you mentioned and sticking to the multi-joint patterns consistently, that's when you're really going to see that change in strength in your body. Not, okay, today I'm going to do an overhead press. Next week, I'm going to do a bench press. The week after, I'm going to do a dip. You might see a little bit of change, but not at the same rate as if you stuck with the same exercise and overloaded it over time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think variability is important, but randomness is going too far. And so I think you've got a really good thought process going here. And I think the main thing is like how much do I need? How much is really, really helpful to me? And so often you'll see people do a really great strength workout. They'll go through those main movement patterns, and then they're going to finish off with some bicep curls and tricep presses. And it's important for them to ask themselves, or for a coach to ask the athlete, what is the purpose of this? Why am I doing this? And within any training program, the athlete should be entitled to say, why are we doing this? And if the answer is because it's super hard, or it's going to make you tougher, or it's going to trash your triceps, then we know that training program is derailed. It's no longer focused on performance. If I'm doing it to get my biceps really tired, or get them huge, or whatever, I'm no longer focusing on climbing performance. If I'm doing it, this happens a lot when people are training for multiple sports. I want to do a marathon and I want to boulder V10. And then we get into these diverging goals that start to conflict with each other. And so one of the things is like, how do I prioritize these things? Are they truly equally important, or can I do them in a different sequence? And so it gets fairly complicated in a hurry, but I think it's important at the end of any training cycle to go back and look. Did I see the improvements that I wanted to see? Were my behaviors matching my goals? And that's like we just mentioned, a little bit of strength gain. Like if you this is great. You're a really experienced athlete. Both of you are experienced athletes. If you were able to see just a tiny gain in strength each month for the next 36 months, you would be like delighted. You'd be like, oh my God, what program is this? I've never even heard of this thing. Even if it was like a teeny tiny gain. One of the things that people do when they're trying to train and get in shape is to like make it happen all at once, And one of the things that Mike Boyle is great. He's a strength coach out of the East Coast, and he talks about people wanting to speed farm. Like you plant the corn and then you like really water it and you put tons of sun on it and you scream at it and you're hoping that it grows even faster. But really what you do to grow corn is give it enough water, enough sun, and then a lot of patience. And that's the same way that we need to build our strength.
That's awesome. Yeah, and I think that people do get discouraged if they aren't seeing those improvements week to week. And maybe, I think some gyms might not have those little micro weights that you can add where it's like, oh, 0.5 pounds. Like that is a huge gain in strength, even though it might seem so little. But it seems like people who might not have those little weights, and then they do seem to kind of stick to the same weight for a couple weeks, get demotivated. And for me, that's just like maybe some time. It's just going to take a little time to be able to make that next jump up to 2.5 pounds. But do you have anything like that you can like say to an athlete that is struggling with some motivation if they're doing everything right, that maybe there's something going wrong with the training, but they are doing something right. Like, what can you keep telling them to keep going?
Well, I think one of the things that's really important is if you've got a base of strength at all, and you're trying to improve that, most people with just regular general strength training will probably get within like 25% of their genetic potential pretty quick, or 50%. They keep, you get fairly strong, and you're like, if you want to gain another 10%, you got to add a whole lot more. And so it starts to slow down. We have these diminishing return curves that start to come in. And so one of the things is like, if I told you I was going to improve your upper body strength by 5% with this training program, the first time I get that 5% improvement might be in 3 sessions. The second time might be 5 or 6 sessions. To make another improvement of 5% might be 10 or 12 sessions. To make another improvement the next time might be 20 more sessions. And 20 sessions of strength training 2 days a week is 10 weeks. So that's like 2.5 months to see a 5% gain. But those of you, both of you are experienced strength trainers, you're like, yeah, that's fair. But a lot of people just don't know that it's that difficult. And so we tell people that it's going to take longer and it's going to be harder than you think. And they're like, yeah. And I was like, okay, I'm just going to come back. I'm going to tell you this again next week because it's the same thing. It's going to take longer and it's going to be harder than you think. And every time you level up, it's going to be a little bit harder. And so we really want to optimize things like recovery and nutrition and all the other associated things around strength in order to not just rely on adaptations in strength to improve our climbing.
Yeah, thank you for that, Steve. That was really wonderful. What I like to add kind of as a reframe for myself, so maybe it helps people out there. I feel like if I'm having a really hard time improving a strength and I've tried everything, kind of what you said, Mercedes, people are doing everything right. You know, that's our assumption. You know, I sleep a lot, I eat really well, I have a great strength coach. Thanks, Mercedes. So I tell myself, well, if it's really hard for me to see improvements, you know, that means I'm already strong. And that's great. And at this point, I keep training to maintain that strength. Because sometimes as humans, we have this idea of always better, always better, always better. But, you know, I mostly strength train to be decently strong as I age and for my climbing. And there's a point where I'm like, you know what? That's great. I have arrived right now. I don't need to get the extra 5% and work 6 months on the extra 5%. If I ever change my mind, I'll come to you, Steve. But, you know, for some things, I'm also okay with where I'm at because I am decently strong and I can focus on other things. And while I do that, I maintain my strength.
That's a super important consideration because maintaining, or what I used to call it maintenance, and everybody's like, yeah, maintenance. So we now call it reinforcement because it's something that people are willing to do. But to reinforce strength is about half as difficult as gaining it in the first place. And so you can say you get up to where you can do 5 repetitions of a pull-up with 50 pounds hanging from your harness. And you're like, whoa, that's pretty strong. I'm in good shape. I can go and address high force pulling about once every 10 to 14 days for a couple of sets and probably maintain that strength for 6 months before it starts to just drop off a little bit. And once it's dropped off by about 10%, then maybe I'll go back in and train that up again. And so a person chasing specific strength might start to partition it into times of the year that I'm going to focus on building, and then I'm going to focus on maintaining the rest of the time. Because strength training and general strength training, although fundamental and important, should take as little of our training time as possible. It's super fun. Some people really get into it and it becomes their focus. But I think you're right. Like, what if we said during the month of December and the month of July, we take 4 weeks and try to really focus and build some strength, really give it those big efforts like I was talking about. And then the rest of those months, you go, look, I'm decently strong. I'm just going to give them these very, very light efforts. I'm maybe going to lift once a week. I'm going to still be lifting hard and heavy, but lower volume. And most of my fitness is going to be maintained by being a rock climber. And I really do think that couple of times a year for a short period of focused effort is more attainable for people than constantly chasing, trying to get better. Because, man, once you start to level off that, that curve, even though it may still be gaining, it may look flat for months and months and months and months. And then, of course, the dips.
So this is really good, where you kind of pointed out that there can be seasons or phases that you can like really focus on strength training. And it's really cool. Like in our membership right now, we have a couple of gals who discovered one of my strength building programs and they all did it together. And they really became like they were surprised by how much strength they gained because they're lifting 4 days a week. And they've never experienced that kind of like shift before. So now it's actually trying to convince them to be like, okay, you've done the work. Now it's time to like taper that off. And so you kind of like said, like maybe once a week can continue to reinforce that strength. What about like just generally, it sounds like maybe you were kind of talking about doing strength training for most people about twice a week if they're training kind of year round. Can you explain kind of like maybe like just generally through the year how much people should be strength training and maybe where they could put it in their session, and then compare that to a reinforcement phase or maybe a performance phase? Because we definitely talk about performance phases.
Yeah. If we generally looked at our year, one of the cool things about dividing up your year into different phases is it makes it interesting, and it makes it motivating. Because if I said, okay, we're going to do, this year's going to be strength 1, and then strength 2, and strength 3, and strength 4, and strength 5, and strength 6, and they're all going to be exactly the same, by June you might be pretty bored with the program. And so, one, we want to have it interesting and motivating, instead of just doing the same training routine or the same climb over and over. A lot of climbers are pulled to the sport because of its variability. And so I want to make sure that there's variability throughout the year. And so you and I sort of program in similar ways, where we have like an off season and then a preparatory part of the year and then a performance part of the year. And there's all kinds of different terms for that. But really, the off-season time is when I'm furthest away from my high performance, and I want to improve in things that are fundamental to my performance or that are clear limiters to my performance. So, for example, I might try to increase my finger strength because I know it's fundamental to performance, and I may try to improve my flexibility because it's starting to show up as a limiter. And that's great to do off season. And in a phase like that, we may even go beyond our 2 days a week and maybe go to 3 days a week of lifting, if it's something that is going to really improve our performance. A lot of times general strength is at a pretty good or maintainable level. And so then we can just sort of let that simmer, keep stirring that pot at the back of the stove while we try to develop these other things. And even within within the workout, some people may be like, I'm super strong on pulling, but my pressing strength isn't that good. So you might have a little more focus there. For a general athlete, though, I would say 3 days a week of strength training in the off-season period. 2 days a week is appropriate, like in a preparatory period or in the run up to a performance phase. And then during a performance phase, probably that 1 day a week of trying to maintain it. The real big mistake that so many climbers make is they get into a performance phase and then they're still trying to chase improving the facets of their fitness. And that is a massive, massive mistake, because by the time you get to your performance phase, you're already at a really high level. And so any adaptation beyond that takes a lot of energy, and your energy needs to be in performance. And the trap of the trainer or the athlete that loves to train is that they are constantly just trying to get a little bit stronger in this and that and whatever. And performance sort of falls off the back. They're just like, yeah, I want to boulder harder, but I'm really interested in getting, 158 on the campus board. And they just stay addressing that to the detriment of their high performance. And so lots of strength in the off season, more or less like one session less in the preparatory phase, and then probably one session a week or one session every 10 days during a performance phase.
Yeah, and actually I do notice on the flip side, sometimes when people are really focused on performance, or maybe they're just like they're traveling a lot and they're going outside, that they actually just completely forget about the strength training. And like we really like I try to say at least like even just like do some body weight training, because like in a performance phase, even your climbing strength, you'll see a strength dip, and your general strength. So with the body weight, we don't have a lot of time, but I have two more kind of big overarching questions to ask you. With body weight training, you know, I'm a big proponent of body weight training, but really like the goal in my mind is to lift as heavy as you can in these prime movements. And body weight training doesn't often lead us to that. It leads us to more variations of body weight training, which might not get you as strong as you could. And so I think like for me, body weight training is a great thing to add in a performance phase. But what about you? Like what are your thoughts on like body weight training? Is it something that you like people to do, to learn? And yeah, just some thoughts on that.
I think bodyweight training is great because it helps, it kind of bridges that gap into specific strength, because it's generally more integrative than weight training can be. And so some of the things, like if you start thinking of like a muscle up, is a really complex movement. It's really hard movement, uses almost the entire upper body musculature. And so there's no arguing that the intensity is correct. If you do 5 muscle ups, and you're just barely eking them out, that's a strength stimulus, but it's a global. And so the body weight style movements, levers, the jumping, leg variations and all kinds of things like that, awesome things. But the rules still apply. If you can do more than 5 repetitions of it, it's probably not still a primary strength stimulus. If you can't do them technically correctly, they're probably more dangerous than useful. And so a combination of some weight stuff and some body weight stuff is really appropriate. A pull-up's a great example. At first, you might need like a elastic band assist to do a pull-up, and then for a while, when you're in that 4 to 6 rep range at body weight is the appropriate stimulus for getting stronger. But then once you can do your 3 or 4 sets of 6 pull-ups at body weight, you need to start adding load there. And so body weight is on the continuum. And it's just beautiful because it's so simple, and there's always a way to initiate an overload. But I think the idea that body weight training and complicated movements are somehow superior to overloading with weights is a little simplistic. And so I think that if you look at them and you go like, you know what, I really like doing body weight, like a front lever, and then I'm going to do a barbell here, I'm going to use a kettlebell for this. I think that that's fine. I think it's really good for people to vary the way that they're training.
Wonderful. So we just talked about pull-ups, and this is my last question. Climbers, at least like especially some of the more advanced climbers that I train, get really anxious if they're not training pull-ups all the time. And you kind of already alluded to like beginners using a lot more upper body pulling motions when they're climbing, so they might not need to train pull-ups directly. But what do you tell people, or how important is training pull-ups? How often do you think people need to actually do it? Just based on, maybe it's a level, but maybe it's more on experience. The thing that I find is that when people are training pull-ups, it is just the easiest gateway into elbow tendonitis, and I trend toward less pull-up training.
Yeah. Pull-ups can be really challenging. I've actually had a pull-up related elbow injury that was bad enough that I did surgery. And so for many years, I didn't do any pull-ups, like zero pull-ups, probably for about 8 years. And I still was able to climb just as hard. I know one climber that climbs in the low 514 range and can't do a pull-up. And so I think that saying X number of pull-ups equals this grade is really simplistic. It makes some sense. Like having the better ability to pull is probably going to help me in climbing. But I think that you get to that, like, I'm strong enough in a big hurry, and always chasing that particular thing is probably just like overemphasizing that athlete's strength. So if I have somebody that is just obsessing with pull-ups, we had a dude in the gym that could do weighted pull-ups with like probably 80% more body weight on. So he'd have like 100 and some pounds tied to his waist and doing these pull-ups. But then was climbing in the 5'11" range. And so, that's great. Chase that number for that number, but not for the performance benefit of it. So I think the big question is, let's look at the entire performance of this athlete and see how essential that is. Is this athlete afraid when they're climbing? Is there a fear thing that comes in? Does this athlete have decent stamina? How's the athlete's footwork? How's their positioning? How's their momentum? All of those things need to come into play if we're really looking at performance here. And if your athlete says, you know what, it's really just important to me to get to where I can do a pull-up with 200 pounds hanging from my waist, that's fine. We'll pursue that as a training goal. But if it's a performance climbing goal, it's almost never the pull-ups that are holding them back.
I love that. And it brings up so much, like, especially like the technical component. Like, you might have a really big gap there if you're focusing so much on pull-ups. And I think with women, especially because it takes them a really long time to develop pull-ups unless they've been doing it since they were very young. And I know that a lot of my like female clients get a little anxious if all of a sudden now they're not doing pull-ups, because it is going to feel harder to get back into being able to do a bodyweight pull-up. And one thing I like and you have studied with this strength coach, Pavel Tsatsouline, I think is like, I don't know how to say his last name, but I love his Grease the Groove protocol. And we can almost use that for people who might feel a little anxious. You could use a little bit of that training, which is, like maybe anytime you walk underneath a pull-up bar, maybe you do a little bit of a pull-up, just to like, that way you're not accumulating any kind of fatigue, but you're using that motor pattern. So that's one thing I've done to like try to ease people's minds with the pull-ups, especially my female clients.
Yeah, I think it is like there's like a performance aspect to it that feels important. Like, I can do this movement where, like, I can do a bodyweight squat. This isn't that important to people. The pull-up is sort of like a high bar. It's a difficult exercise. But I think, like, addressing it through more sport specific means during certain phases of the year is really important. I like to think of it as a general exercise that doesn't have to be there every single week. And we can do, you probably know more than 100 different pulling exercises that we could do instead and still reap benefit from them. And some of them are more beneficial to climbing. And we can talk about that more when we go into specific movement. But I think that's the thing, is like, am I over fixating on something? Like, if we looked at a big wheel, pie chart, and said what percentage of climbing performance is pull-ups? You wouldn't even be able to see which color that pie was, because it'd be like less than 1% of performance. And like, probably shoe selection and sizing is more important than how many pull-ups you can do. And so we really need to keep that in perspective, no matter how much we love an exercise.
Amazing. Katya, you had something.
Well, we are almost done, so I thought I would wrap up this really amazing conversation with a personal question for Steve. Okay, Steve, this is for you, not for your athletes. What is your favorite strength exercise?
I like the Turkish get-up. The get-up is a complex exercise. It's what we would call, multi-joint, multi-plane. And one of the things is, if you are really strapped for time, or if you're just not knowing what to do, and you say, like, okay, I'm only going to get a couple of things done, the get-up is one of the best things overall for stability for your ability to move through different ranges of motion, and to generate some strength from your core. And so one of the things that we'll talk about in the future conversation is that core integration and the integration of several movements. But yeah, I'd like to get up.
Awesome.
Amazing.
Thank you for sharing.
Okay, so we're going to wrap this up. So next conversation is going to be about specific strength. Yeah, so excited for that one. Thanks again, Steve and Katja. Appreciate your time, and we'll catch you soon.
Yeah, so great to talk to you guys. Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.